At exactly 6:17 a.m., 5 massive trucks filled with stolen gold rolled slowly through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. Behind them walked 50 captured men, hands bound, heads bowed in shame, including 4 French agents whose expensive suits were now covered in the red dust of Africa. At the front of this unprecedented procession marched Ibrahim Traoré, moving like a lion through his territory, commanding respect with every step. When he finally stopped and turned to face the growing crowd of bewildered citizens, he spoke. Just 5 words that would reverberate across continents and shake the foundations of neo-colonial exploitation. Behold the thieves of Africa. The crowd erupted. Children climbed onto rooftops for a better view. Women wept openly. Men shouted in disbelief. Cell phones emerged from pockets. Drones buzzed overhead, and international reporters scrambled to capture this historic moment. The world was watching as a young African leader exposed what many had suspected, but few had dared to confront: the systematic theft of Africa's wealth by foreign powers operating in the shadows. But this dramatic parade was merely the culmination of events that had begun 2 days earlier in the remote forests of northern Burkina Faso, where secrets lay buried as deep as the gold beneath the earth. Deep in the northern forests of Burkina Faso, where even the bravest rarely venture, a clandestine mining operation had been functioning quietly for years. No government permits, no environmental oversight, no official documentation, just massive machinery, foreign engineers, and armed guards methodically extracting wealth from the earth and smuggling it out under cover of darkness. The operation was a masterpiece of deception. During daylight hours, the site appeared abandoned, covered by carefully placed vegetation and camouflage nets. But as the sun set each evening, the forest came alive with the hum of generators, the rumble of excavators, and the whispered conversations of men who spoke in accented French, their voices carrying the authority of those accustomed to operating above the law. The neighboring villagers had always sensed something wasn't right. They witnessed strange men coming and going at odd hours, heard unexplained underground explosions that shook their mud-brick homes, and noticed convoys of trucks, moving through the darkness but never returning by the same route. The very air seemed different, heavier, tainted with the metallic smell of disturbed earth and diesel fumes. When concerned villagers attempted to report these suspicious activities, local officials dismissed their concerns with practiced indifference. "It's legal," they would say, or "it's classified government business." Some villagers were warned not to ask questions, while others received small payments to keep quiet. The message was clear: look the other way, and you'll be safe. But one villager refused to be silenced. Isaka, a weathered old man whose family had lived in these forests for generations, understood that something precious was being stolen from his homeland. His grandfather had told him stories of the gold that lay beneath their feet, gold that belonged to their people, not to foreign strangers operating in secret. Determined to expose the truth, Isaka made a fateful decision. He would send his grandson, a brave teenager named Bukari, on a dangerous journey to the capital with evidence of what was happening in their forest. It was a decision that would change the course of history. Bukari was only 17, but he possessed the courage of men twice his age. His grandfather's urgent whispers had painted a picture of systematic theft, and the young man understood that he carried the hopes of his entire village on his shoulders. The journey to Ouagadougou would be perilous. Over 200 kilometers of rough terrain, with no money for transportation and only the clothes on his back. For 2 grueling days, Bukari walked through scorching heat and bone-chilling nights. His feet bled in his worn sandals, his water ran out, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. But he pressed on, occasionally catching rides from sympathetic truck drivers who recognized the determination in his young eyes. When he finally reached the bustling capital, exhausted and covered in dust, Bukari faced his greatest challenge: getting someone in power to listen to a poor village boy's incredible story. He spent hours outside government buildings, pleading with guards and secretaries, his voice hoarse from desperation. Most dismissed him as just another rural youth seeking attention. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. By pure chance, or perhaps divine intervention, Boukari's story reached the ears of Colonel Sidiki Sanou, a trusted military officer known for his integrity and direct access to President Ibrahim Traoré. Something in the boy's earnest demeanor and specific details convinced the colonel that this was no fabrication. That very afternoon, Colonel Sanou walked into President Traoré's office and delivered a message that would ignite a fire of righteous anger. Mr. President, we have a situation in the northern forests that demands immediate attention. Ibrahim Traoré listened intently as Colonel Sanou relayed Boukari's testimony. The young president's jaw tightened with each detail: the secret mining operation, the foreign agents, the suspicious truck movements, the silence of local officials. This wasn't just theft. It was a violation of sovereignty, a betrayal that cut to the heart of everything Traoré had sworn to protect. Without hesitation, Traoré canceled all his scheduled meetings for the remainder of the day. He summoned his most trusted elite unit, commanders, and delivered a message that left no room for interpretation. We move tonight. No press, no advance warning, no mercy for those who steal from our people. The operation required meticulous planning. Satellite reconnaissance confirmed the location described by young Boukari, and thermal imaging revealed significant activity at the site. Advanced surveillance drones operated by Burkina Faso's best technical specialists provided real-time intelligence about the number of personnel, vehicles, and the scale of the operation. What the reconnaissance revealed was staggering. The mining operation was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Sophisticated equipment worth millions of dollars had been secretly transported into the forest. Underground tunnels stretched for kilometers, and massive processing facilities had been constructed beneath camouflage covers. This wasn't a small-scale theft. It was industrial-level plunder. Most shocking of all was the presence of foreign nationals who were clearly not ordinary miners or engineers. These men moved with military precision, carried advanced communication equipment, and were protected by well-armed African mercenaries wearing unmarked black uniforms. The operation bore all the hallmarks of a sophisticated intelligence-backed extraction scheme. As darkness fell over Burkina Faso, President Traoré personally led a convoy of armored vehicles toward the forest. This wasn't just about recovering stolen gold. It was about sending a message to every foreign power that thought Africa's wealth was theirs for the taking. Under the cover of complete darkness, Ibrahim Traoré's convoy approached the clandestine mining site with the stealth of experienced hunters. The president had insisted on leading the operation personally, ignoring the protests of his security advisors who worried about the risks to his safety. A leader who won't risk his life for his people's dignity doesn't deserve to lead, Traoré had told them firmly. As they neared the target area, the scale of the criminal enterprise became even more apparent. Powerful floodlights illuminated massive excavation sites, while the constant hum of generators and heavy machinery filled the night air. Trucks were being loaded with what appeared to be processed gold, ready for transport along secret routes. Through advanced night vision equipment, the strike team observed the operation's hierarchy. White foreign agents, speaking in hushed French, supervised every aspect of the loading process. They used satellite phones to coordinate with unseen contacts, checked documents that bore official-looking seals, and directed African workers with the casual authority of colonial masters. The sight filled Traoré with a cold rage. This was colonialism in its modern form. No flags, no armies, just sophisticated theft backed by corrupt local officials and foreign intelligence networks. At precisely 2:30 a.m., Traoré gave the signal his forces had been waiting for. Encircle them. Block all escape routes. Capture everyone. The operation unfolded with military precision. Within seconds, flares lit up the forest like daylight, and the thunder of helicopter rotors filled the air. The criminals found themselves surrounded by Burkina Faso's elite forces, emerging from the forest like avenging spirits. Panic erupted at the mining site. Foreign agents grabbed their satellite phones, trying desperately to contact their handlers. Truck drivers attempted to flee, only to find their escape routes blocked by armored vehicles. Some of the mercenaries reached for their weapons, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted exactly 7 minutes. Not a single criminal escaped. The foreign agents, accustomed to operating with impunity, found themselves face to face with African justice. As dawn broke over the forest, President Traoré personally approached the captured convoy of trucks. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. This was more than a law enforcement operation. It was a reclamation of national dignity. "Open the first truck," he ordered his soldiers. When they pulled back the tarpaulin covering, the morning sun caught a brilliant golden gleam that took everyone's breath away. Stacks upon stacks of gold bars, each weighing several kilograms, were packed tight and hidden under black plastic sheets. The soldiers, hardened veterans of many operations, stared in amazement at the sheer quantity of wealth that had been destined for foreign vaults. The second truck revealed even more treasure. The third contained wooden crates marked with French mining company logos, some hastily spray-painted over but still partially visible. The attempted concealment only made the theft more obvious and the criminals' guilt more apparent. As they inventoried the seized gold, the full scope of the crime became clear. Conservative estimates placed the value at over $50 million, wealth that belonged to the people of Burkina Faso, but would have disappeared forever into Swiss banks and European refineries. But Traoré knew that the gold itself, while valuable, was not the real prize. The real treasure was the opportunity to expose the entire network of corruption and foreign exploitation that had been bleeding Africa dry for decades. "We're not hiding this," he declared to his assembled team. "We're showing it to the world." The captured foreign agents, still in shock from their sudden reversal of fortune, watched in growing horror as their carefully planned operation crumbled around them. For years, they had operated with the confidence that comes from bought protection and diplomatic immunity. Now they faced the reality of African justice. Back at military headquarters in Ouagadougou, President Traoré worked through the night to prepare what would become one of the most significant public demonstrations in modern African history. This wouldn't be a simple press conference or government statement. It would be a parade of truth that exposed the reality of neo-colonial theft. The logistics were complex. The 5 trucks needed to be cleaned and refueled for the journey to the capital. The captured prisoners had to be securely transported while ensuring their safety. Traoré was determined that this operation would be conducted according to the highest legal standards. Security arrangements required coordination with multiple agencies to ensure public safety during what was sure to be an emotionally charged event. Most importantly, Traoré spent hours crafting the message he would deliver to his people and the world. This wasn't just about one theft. It was about a pattern of exploitation that had continued from the colonial era into the present day. The words needed to be precise, powerful, and impossible to misinterpret. "For too long," he wrote in his notes, "Africa's wealth has been stolen in darkness, hidden behind false contracts and corrupt officials. Today we bring this theft into the light for all to see." International diplomatic channels began buzzing with activity as news of the operation leaked out. French embassy officials made urgent calls to their superiors in Paris. Regional governments, some complicit in similar schemes, watched nervously to see how far Traoré would push this confrontation. The president knew that powerful forces would mobilize against him. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, even military threats were possibilities he had to consider. But he also knew that the moment had come to draw a line in the sand. As the first rays of dawn began to illuminate Ouagadougou, word spread through the city that something unprecedented was about to happen. By 5:45 a.m., the streets were lined with thousands of citizens who had heard rumors of their president's nighttime operation. The procession that began at 6:17 a.m. on that historic morning would be remembered for generations. 5 massive trucks, their golden cargo gleaming in the early sunlight, rolled slowly through the heart of Ouagadougou. The sight was so surreal, so unprecedented, that many citizens initially thought they were witnessing some kind of elaborate film production, but the reality soon became undeniable. These weren't props or movie sets. This was real gold, massive quantities of it, being displayed openly for all to see. Behind the trucks walked 50 captured men, their heads bowed in shame, including 4 white foreigners whose expensive suits were now wrinkled and dusty. At the front of this remarkable parade walked President Ibrahim Traoré himself, choosing to lead on foot rather than ride in an armored vehicle. It was a powerful symbolic gesture, a leader walking among his people, sharing in their moment of vindication. The crowds grew larger with each block. Children ran alongside the convoy, their young voices raised in celebration. Elderly women wept openly, seeing with their own eyes the wealth that had been stolen from their grandchildren's future. Men who had long suspected such theft was occurring felt a mixture of anger and vindication. International media crews, alerted by the unprecedented nature of the event, scrambled to capture every moment. Satellite uplinks transmitted the images around the world in real time, showing global audiences something they had never seen before. An African leader openly displaying recovered stolen wealth and the foreign agents who had taken it. The psychological impact was profound. For decades, African leaders had been portrayed as corrupt and incompetent, while foreign partners were presented as beneficial investors. Now the world was seeing the reverse. An incorruptible African president exposing foreign thieves and their local collaborators. When the convoy reached the National Assembly building, the crowd had swelled to over 10,000 people. The energy was electric, charged with emotions that had been building for generations. This was more than a political demonstration. It was a moment of collective catharsis for a people who had suffered too long in silence. President Traoré climbed onto one of the gold-laden trucks, standing tall above the crowd that stretched, as far as the eye could see. The symbolism was powerful, an African leader literally standing on recovered African wealth, addressing his people as a free man in a free nation. The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to witness history. Even the foreign journalists stopped their chatter, recognizing the gravity of the moment. Traoré's voice, amplified by speakers throughout the square, carried clearly to every corner of the gathering. For years they have stolen from us in silence, in darkness, with false contracts and corrupted officials. But today, we bring their crimes into the light. He pointed to the gold behind him, then to the captured prisoners below. These men are not visitors. They are not partners. They are not investors. They are thieves. And today, their theft has been exposed for all to see. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. But Traoré wasn't finished. His next words would be quoted in newspapers and broadcast on television networks around the world. This gold was bound for Côte d'Ivoire, then on to Europe. Nothing was registered, nothing would have returned to our people. And the worst part, they were helped by people within our own system, people who sold their country for foreign money. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. The idea that fellow Burkinabe citizens had collaborated in this theft added a layer of betrayal. That cut especially deep. But Traoré had saved his most dramatic moment for last. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, holding it high for all to see. This envelope contains a list of names, high-ranking Burkinabe officials, ministers, and military officers who were part of this operation. The crowd's reaction was explosive. Thousands of voices rose in a mixture of anger, disbelief, and demands for justice. Everyone knew that powerful people would be implicated, but seeing the evidence in their president's hand made it undeniably real. "You know who you are," Traoré continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "Come forward now, or I will come for you myself." The city of Ouagadougou didn't sleep that night. After the Golden Parade, citizens gathered in cafes, community centers, and street corners, discussing in hushed tones and excited bursts what they had witnessed. The sealed envelope containing the names of traitors had shaken the entire country to its core. In the corridors of power, phones rang incessantly as ministers canceled their public appearances and businessmen switched off their phones. Some government. Buildings were eerily empty the following morning, their usual occupants suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. But President Traoré wasn't waiting. He returned to his office at military headquarters and called an emergency meeting with only 5 of his most trusted advisors, men whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of previous challenges and proven unbreakable. The envelope lay on the conference table like a loaded weapon. "Gentlemen," Traoré said gravely, "these are not just names on a list. These are the people who have sold our country piece by piece, generation by generation." He opened the envelope with deliberate ceremony. Inside were 12 names, each representing a different aspect of the betrayal. 6 were cabinet ministers, including some who had served multiple administrations and were considered pillars of the establishment. 2 were high-ranking generals who had used their military positions to facilitate the criminal operation. 4 were directors of national companies, the very institutions responsible for protecting the nation's mineral wealth. But one name caused the room to fall into complete silence: the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, second only to the president in terms of influence over the nation's mineral policy. He had been present at every major government function, always smiling for cameras, always speaking eloquently about national development. Behind the scenes, however, he had signed fraudulent documents, approved illegal mining licenses, and taken millions in bribes from foreign interests. "I want him arrested before sunset," Traoré declared, his eyes narrowing with determination. An elite team was dispatched immediately to the minister's lavish mansion in the affluent Ouaga 2000 district. But when they arrived, they found the house empty, abandoned with such haste that expensive meals were still warm on the dining table and luxury cars remained in the garage. The minister had fled at dawn, using a private vehicle with forged diplomatic plates to cross into neighboring Côte d'Ivoire. But he wasn't alone in his escape. Investigation revealed that 2 other names from the list had also vanished, one crossing into Côte d'Ivoire just hours before the gold trucks had arrived in the capital, another taking a private jet to France under the pretense of official government business. The coordinated nature of their escapes revealed the sophistication of the criminal network. These weren't panicked individuals making desperate decisions. This was an organized retreat by people who had contingency plans for exactly this scenario. "Cancel their passports, freeze their properties, and track every account," Traoré ordered his intelligence chief. "If they think distance will protect them, they're about to learn otherwise." That same evening, Traoré held a press conference that was broadcast live on national television and simultaneously transmitted to international networks. The room was packed with journalists, diplomats, and citizens, all eager to hear what revelations would come next. Looking directly into the camera, his voice steady and unwavering, Traoré delivered a message that would be repeated in news broadcasts around the world. 3 of the traitors have already fled, which proves their guilt. But let me be clear, there is no border strong enough to protect those who betray their people. We will find them, we will bring them back, and they will face the justice they have tried so hard to avoid. The room erupted with questions, but Traoré ignored them all. Instead, He took out the list again and did something no African president had ever done before. He read the names aloud, one by one, along with their positions and their crimes. The public reading of the traitors list sent shockwaves through every level of Burkinabe society. In homes across the nation, families gathered around television sets and radios, listening in stunned silence as their president methodically exposed the web of corruption that had been operating in their midst. Each name brought gasps of disbelief. These weren't obscure bureaucrats or minor officials. These were men who had been trusted with the nation's most precious resources. They had attended state ceremonies, given speeches about patriotism and development, and all the while been selling their country's future to foreign interests. In one particularly tragic scene broadcast live, a man in Bobo Dioulasso collapsed in front of his television when he heard his brother's name read from the list. The betrayal was personal as well as national. Families were discovering that their own relatives had been part of this massive theft. The psychological impact extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, citizens began to wonder what similar networks might be operating in their own countries. The revelation that corruption could reach such heights, involving not just individual greed, but coordinated foreign exploitation, forced a continent-wide examination of conscience. Traoré's words during that press conference would be quoted for years to come. This is what colonization looks like in 2025, not with armies or flags, but with contracts, silence, and men who sell their birthright for foreign gold. Just as the nation was trying to absorb the shock of these revelations, another bombshell exploded, this time from across the border. The Ivorian government, caught in the international spotlight, issued a confused statement denying any connection to the gold smuggling route. But their denials rang hollow when a whistleblower within their customs department leaked documents, showing that 2 gold trucks had been scheduled to pass through a protected corridor in Côte d'Ivoire. The leaked papers revealed detailed coordination between Ivorian officials and the smuggling network, including specific routes, timing, and protection arrangements. This meant that the betrayal wasn't confined to Burkina Faso. It extended across borders, involving a regional network of corrupt officials who had turned West Africa's porous boundaries into highways for resource theft. The implications were staggering. If such operations could involve multiple countries, how many other schemes were currently underway? How much African wealth was being stolen every day through similar networks? President Traoré studied the leaked documents with a mixture of anger and determination. The evidence showed that powerful Ivorian officials had knowingly allowed gold-laden trucks to pass through their territory, providing security escorts and customs clearances in exchange for substantial payments. "This isn't just theft," he told his Security Council. "It's a coordinated assault on African sovereignty." Within hours of receiving the leaked documents, Traoré made a decision that would further escalate the international crisis. He ordered a special task force to cross into Côte d'Ivoire, accompanied by trusted diplomats and security experts, to confront the corrupt customs officials identified in the leaked papers. The mission was delicate. Any misstep could trigger a larger regional conflict. But Traoré knew that allowing criminals to escape justice simply because they had crossed a border would send the wrong message to other corrupt networks. At the border checkpoint, the task force found clear evidence of the conspiracy. Falsified documents, stamped approvals from senior customs officials, and even photographs showing gold being unloaded at warehouses controlled by shadowy companies. Several Ivorian officials were arrested on the spot, their protestations of innocence undermined by the overwhelming evidence. But when news of the DA arrests reached Abidjan, the Ivorian government exploded in indignation, claiming the arrests were illegal violations of their sovereignty. The diplomatic crisis escalated rapidly. Côte d'Ivoire accused Burkina Faso of aggression and provocation, while international observers struggled to understand the complex legal and political implications of one nation pursuing criminals across another's borders. Meanwhile, back in Ouagadougou, the domestic political fallout continued to worsen. The implicated ministers and officials began turning against each other, desperately trying to save themselves by exposing their former colleagues. As the investigation deepened, new documents surfaced that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise. Swiss bank accounts, offshore shell companies, and complex money laundering schemes painted a picture of systematic theft that had been operating for years. The financial trails led to some shocking discoveries. Millions of dollars had flowed from secret accounts in Switzerland and Dubai to officials throughout West Africa. The money transfers were traced to shell companies linked to major French mining corporations, some of which had official contracts with multiple African governments. One name kept appearing in the financial records, a powerful businessman with close ties to the government who had been the hidden force behind much of the illegal mining activity. When Traoré ordered his arrest, police found his mansion empty except for a taunting note. "You may catch me, but you'll never catch the truth." The message was clear. The deeper Traoré dug, the more he threatened a vast network of criminals, some of whom enjoyed protection from powerful foreign interests. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. Explosions rocked government buildings associated with the investigation team. No one was killed, but the message was unmistakable. There were forces willing to use violence to protect their criminal enterprise. Traoré's security was tightened considerably, but he refused to slow down the investigation. "If we stop now," he told his advisors, "we become complicit in our own exploitation." Understanding that the scale of the corruption required extraordinary measures, Traoré announced the formation of a special investigative commission composed of trusted judges, military officers, and international observers. Their mandate was comprehensive: investigate every aspect of the illegal gold trade and the corruption that enabled it. The commission worked with the dedication of people who understood they were participating in a historic moment. Testimonies poured in from multiple sources: captured smugglers eager to reduce their sentences, whistleblowers from within mining companies, and even foreign intelligence operatives willing to trade information for immunity. Slowly, the complete picture emerged of a shadow government of corrupt officials, foreign businessmen, and criminal networks that had been systematically draining Burkina Faso's wealth. The operation was far more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined, involving high-tech mining equipment, satellite communications, and financial instruments worthy of a major corporation. But perhaps most shocking was the discovery of how long the scheme had been operating. Financial records suggested that similar operations had been running for over a decade, adapting and evolving as political situations changed, but never ceasing their extraction of African wealth. Throughout this period of revelations and investigations, the people of Burkina Faso remained engaged and supportive of their president's efforts. Public squares filled with citizens demanding swift justice, while traditional leaders and religious figures offered prayers for the success of the anti-corruption campaign. The psychological impact of seeing their stolen wealth displayed so openly had been profound. For many Burkinabés, it was the first time they had concrete evidence of the abstract concept of resource theft they had heard about for years. Seeing actual gold bars that should have funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure made the crime visceral and personal. Community organizations began forming to monitor local mining activities and report suspicious behavior. Village chiefs, inspired by young Boukari's courage in initially reporting the crime, established networks to ensure that such large-scale theft could never again operate in secret. The cultural impact extended to art, music, and literature. Poets composed verses about the Golden Parade, musicians wrote songs celebrating their president's courage, and artists created paintings depicting the moment when stolen wealth was reclaimed. The international reaction to Traoré's actions was mixed and complex. Western governments, particularly France, initially responded with diplomatic caution, neither condemning nor supporting the investigation. Behind the scenes, however, pressure was mounting on Burkina Faso to handle the matter quietly through appropriate diplomatic channels. African leaders, watching carefully to see how this unprecedented situation would unfold, began to split into different camps. Some, feeling vulnerable about their own potential exposure to similar investigations, distanced themselves from Traoré's methods. Others, inspired by his courage, began their own anti-corruption initiatives. International human rights organizations praised the transparency of the investigation while urging that all suspects receive fair trials according to international legal standards. Mining industry groups, meanwhile, issued statements about the importance of stable investment climates and established legal procedures. The complexity of international law regarding cross-border pursuit of criminals created additional challenges. Legal experts debated whether Traoré's forces had the right to arrest suspects in neighboring countries, while diplomatic channels worked overtime to prevent the situation from escalating into a regional conflict. Months of investigation, arrests, and legal preparation led to what would become the largest corruption trial in Burkina Faso's history. The courthouse was filled to capacity with reporters, officials, and citizens eager for justice after decades of exploitation. The French agents captured during the original operation were brought to trial in chains, their former confidence replaced by the grim reality of facing African justice. Behind them, trucks of recovered gold gleamed in the courtroom lights, serving as evidence of the massive scale of their theft. Traoré opened the trial with a speech that would be quoted in law schools and political science courses for decades to come. This is more than a trial. It's a message to every thief and traitor that Africa's wealth is not yours to steal. One by one, witnesses testified to a pattern of corruption that had operated like a well-oiled machine. Former smugglers told stories of bribes, secret meetings, and how French agents had worked with corrupt ministers to systematically plunder the country's resources. The evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings, financial documents, and testimonies all painted a picture of organized criminal activity that had operated with impunity for years. The courtroom audience gasped as secret recordings were played, showing ministers negotiating with foreign agents about how to circumvent customs procedures and hide gold shipments. The trial's conclusion brought sentences that reflected the severity of the crimes. Ministers received lengthy prison terms and had their assets confiscated. The French agents faced extradition demands and international legal battles that would continue for years. Even some media companies, caught spreading disinformation about the case to protect the criminals, faced investigations and fines. The message was clear. Anyone who participated in or facilitated the theft would face consequences. Outside the courthouse, thousands of citizens celebrated what they saw as a victory for justice and national sovereignty. But Traoré knew the battle was far from over. Criminal networks could rebuild, adapt, and return with new methods and different collaborators. The president understood that this victory, while significant, was only the beginning of a longer struggle. The systems that had allowed such massive theft to occur needed to be reformed, strengthened, and protected against future exploitation. In the months following the trial, President Traoré initiated comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future resource theft. New legislation required all mining operations to obtain multiple layers of approval, including community consent and environmental assessments. Advanced monitoring systems, using satellite technology and blockchain verification, were implemented to track all mineral exports from the country. Every gram of gold leaving Burkina Faso would be documented, verified, and traced to ensure it contributed to national development rather than foreign enrichment. International partnerships were established with countries committed to fighting resource theft and corruption. Intelligence sharing agreements helped track criminal networks across borders, while new financial regulations made it harder to hide stolen wealth in offshore accounts. Educational programs were launched to help citizens recognize and report suspicious mining activities. The story of young Bukari's courage in initially exposing the theft became part of the national curriculum, inspiring a new generation of citizens to actively protect their country's resources. The events that began with a dawn parade through Ouagadougou had consequences far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, leaders began implementing similar transparency measures and anti-corruption initiatives inspired by Traoré's example. The phrase, "Behold the thieves of Africa," became a rallying cry for activists and leaders throughout the continent, who were fighting their own battles against resource theft and corruption. The image of an African president literally standing on recovered stolen wealth became an iconic symbol of resistance against neo-colonial exploitation. International mining companies found themselves under increased scrutiny, with communities and governments demanding greater transparency and accountability in their operations. The days of secret deals and hidden extraction were increasingly challenged by informed and organized local populations. Years after the Golden Parade, President Traoré continued to emphasize that the fight against resource theft required constant vigilance. New threats emerged as criminal networks adapted their methods, using more sophisticated technology and different routes to continue their theft. The Special Investigative Commission became a permanent institution, regularly auditing mining operations and financial flows to ensure compliance with anti-corruption measures. Its work expanded to include other sectors vulnerable to exploitation, including agriculture, timber, and telecommunications. Regional cooperation improved as neighboring countries recognized that resource theft was a shared challenge requiring coordinated responses. Joint task forces were established to monitor cross-border criminal activities, while diplomatic protocols were developed to handle similar situations in the future. The transformation that began with 5 trucks of recovered gold had evolved into something much larger. A fundamental shift in how Africa approached its relationship with foreign powers and its own natural resources. The principle that African wealth should benefit African people had been established not just in rhetoric, but through concrete action. Young people across the continent, inspired by the story of Bukari and the courage of Ibrahim Traoré, began demanding greater accountability from their own leaders. The idea that resource theft was simply how things work was being challenged by a new generation that had seen proof that change was possible. Economic indicators in Burkina Faso showed the positive impact of keeping mineral wealth within the country. Revenue that previously would have disappeared into foreign accounts was now funding infrastructure projects, educational programs, and healthcare initiatives that directly benefited citizens. As the sun set over Ouagadougou on the anniversary of that historic dawn parade, President Ibrahim Traoré stood at his office window, reflecting on the events that had transformed his nation and inspired a continent. The recovered gold had been processed in new Burkina refineries and transformed into investments in the country's future. The young man who had once walked through the dusty streets displaying stolen wealth to his people had become a symbol of what was possible when leaders chose courage over comfort, transparency over secrecy, and justice over profit. The lessons learned from that extraordinary morning continued to reverberate across Africa and beyond. The simple act of exposing theft in broad daylight had demonstrated that the emperor truly had no clothes, that the sophisticated networks of exploitation that had operated for decades could be dismantled by determined leadership and an informed citizenry. In the years following the Golden Parade, similar operations were uncovered across West Africa. Inspired by Burkina Faso's success, citizens in Mali, Niger, and Guinea began reporting suspicious mining activities to their governments. Some leaders responded with enthusiasm, launching their own anti-corruption campaigns. Others, perhaps, feeling threatened by the precedent Traoré had set, attempted to suppress such reports. The contrast became stark and undeniable. Countries that embraced transparency and accountability saw improvements in their economic indicators, infrastructure, development, and citizen satisfaction. Those that continued to allow resource theft struggled with persistent poverty despite their natural wealth. International investors, initially concerned about the instability caused by anti-corruption efforts, gradually recognized that transparent systems actually provided more security for legitimate business operations. Companies that had built their African strategies on corrupt relationships found themselves at a disadvantage compared to those willing to operate under fair and open conditions. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Criminal networks adapted their methods using more sophisticated technology and different routes. Some attempted to destabilize governments that threatened their operations, funding opposition groups and spreading disinformation through social media and local radio stations. But the foundation had been laid. The precedent established by Ibrahim Traoré's courage had shown that African leaders could successfully confront foreign exploitation and win. The psychological barrier that had prevented such confrontations for decades had been broken. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the events was on Africa's youth. Young people who had grown up hearing about corruption and resource theft as inevitable facts of life suddenly saw that change was possible. They began organizing themselves using social media and mobile technology to monitor mining activities, track government spending, and demand accountability from their leaders. Universities across the continent began teaching courses on resource, governance, and anti-corruption strategies. Students studied the Burkina Faso model as an example of how small countries could successfully challenge powerful international interests. Scholarship programs were established to train young Africans in the technical skills needed to monitor and manage their country's natural resources. The story of Boukari, the brave teenager who had walked for days to report the theft, became particularly inspirational to young people. His courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds demonstrated that individual action could catalyze massive change. Schools began teaching his story alongside traditional heroes and historical figures. Community organizations led by young people spread across the continent, establishing networks to monitor mining activities and report suspicious behavior. These groups used innovative technologies like satellite imagery, blockchain tracking, and mobile apps to create transparency in sectors that had previously operated in shadows. The economic impact of keeping mineral wealth within Burkina Faso became increasingly evident as years passed. Revenue that would have disappeared into foreign accounts was reinvested in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Roads were built connecting previously isolated mining areas to markets. Schools and hospitals were constructed in regions that had been ignored for generations. The government established a sovereign wealth fund, managed transparently with regular public reporting to ensure that mineral revenues would benefit future generations rather than just current politicians. Citizens could track online exactly how much revenue was generated from their natural resources and how those funds were being invested. Local processing capabilities were developed, adding value to raw materials before export. Gold refineries, copper processing plants, and other industrial facilities created jobs while increasing the economic value of the country's mineral wealth. The days when raw materials were simply extracted and shipped abroad were ending. Agricultural development programs, funded by mineral revenues, helped diversify the economy and reduce dependence on resource extraction alone. Farmers received modern equipment, irrigation systems, and access to markets that had previously been unavailable. The combination of mineral wealth and agricultural development created a more stable economic foundation. Burkina Faso's transformation elevated the country's status within regional and continental organizations. President Traoré found himself frequently invited to speak at African Union summits, economic forums, and international conferences about governance and development. The country became a case study for successful resource management, attracting visits from government delegations, academic researchers, and development organizations eager to understand and replicate the model. Training programs were established to share expertise with other African countries facing similar challenges. Regional cooperation improved significantly as neighboring countries recognized the benefits of transparent resource management. Joint initiatives were launched to combat cross-border crime, share intelligence about corruption networks, and coordinate economic development strategies. The success also attracted positive attention from international development partners who had grown frustrated with traditional aid approaches. Instead of simply providing financial assistance, donors began supporting capacity-building programs that helped other countries implement similar transparency measures. Despite the remarkable success, the fight against resource theft required constant adaptation to new challenges. Criminal networks evolved their methods, using cryptocurrency to hide financial transactions, employing more sophisticated communication technologies, and recruiting local partners who could operate below the radar of monitoring systems. Cybersecurity became a critical concern as hackers, possibly sponsored by foreign interests, attempted to disrupt the tracking systems that monitored mineral exports. The government invested heavily in cybersecurity capabilities and international partnerships to protect its digital infrastructure. Political challenges also emerged as some opposition groups, possibly funded by interests threatened by the anti-corruption campaign, attempted to portray the reforms as harmful to economic growth. They argued that strict oversight discouraged foreign investment and slowed economic development. President Traoré addressed these challenges directly, providing regular public reports on economic indicators that demonstrated the positive impact of transparent resource management. The data consistently showed that legitimate investment had actually increased as international partners gained confidence in the country's stable and predictable business environment. The transformation of Burkina Faso gained international recognition through various awards and acknowledgments from transparency organizations, development agencies, and academic institutions. But President Traoré consistently emphasized that recognition was not the goal. Sustainable development and citizen welfare were the true measures of success. Awards and praise from foreigners mean nothing if our own people are still struggling, he often said in speeches. Our success will be measured by whether children in remote villages have schools, whether mothers have access to health care, and whether young people have opportunities to build better lives. The vigilance required to maintain transparent systems remained constant. New mining projects required extensive community consultation, environmental impact assessments, and multiple levels of approval. Every export shipment was tracked and verified through multiple independent systems. Citizen engagement remained high years after the initial Golden Parade. Community groups continued monitoring local mining activities, government spending remained subject to public scrutiny, and regular town halls provided forums for citizens to ask questions and raise concerns about resource management. The success in Burkina Faso catalyzed similar movements across Africa. In Ghana, citizen groups began demanding greater transparency in gold mining operations. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, communities affected by mining operations organized to ensure they received fair compensation and environmental protection. South African activists used the Burkina Faso model to challenge mining companies operating in their country, demanding greater community participation in decisions affecting their land and resources. Nigerian youth organizations began monitoring oil revenues and demanding accountability in how petroleum wealth was managed. The phrase "African wealth for African development" became a continental rallying cry, challenging decades of extraction-based economic relationships with former colonial powers and other foreign interests. Academic institutions across Africa began collaborating on research into resource governance, sharing best practices and developing innovative approaches to transparency and accountability. The University of Ouagadougou became a center for these studies, attracting students and researchers from across the continent. As President Ibrahim Traoré's time in office progressed, the question of succession and continuity became increasingly important. The systems and institutions created to combat resource theft needed to survive beyond any individual leader to ensure lasting transformation. Constitutional reforms were implemented to strengthen institutional independence and prevent future leaders from easily dismantling anti-corruption measures. The judiciary was reinforced with additional resources and protections to ensure it could operate independently of political pressure. Civil society organizations were strengthened and given formal roles in monitoring government activities and resource management. Their participation in oversight processes was embedded in legal frameworks rather than depending on political goodwill. Educational curricula were updated to ensure that future generations understood both the history of resource exploitation and the importance of maintaining vigilance against corruption. Civic education programs taught citizens about their rights and responsibilities in protecting their country's wealth. The events that began with 5 trucks of stolen gold had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how an African nation related to its natural resources, its citizens, and the international community. The changes extended far beyond mining to include reforms in agriculture, telecommunications, banking, and other sectors vulnerable to exploitation. Government transparency became the norm rather than the exception. Cabinet meetings were regularly broadcast, government contracts were published online, and citizen feedback was systematically collected and responded to. The culture of secrecy that had enabled corruption was replaced by a presumption of openness. International relationships were restructured based on mutual respect and shared benefit rather than exploitation. Trade agreements were negotiated transparently, with input from affected communities. Foreign investment was welcomed but regulated to ensure it contributed to national development rather than simply extracting wealth. The psychological transformation of the population was perhaps most significant. Citizens who had once accepted corruption as inevitable became active participants in preventing it. The sense of powerlessness that had characterized previous generations was replaced by confidence that change was possible and sustainable. The Burkina Faso experience offered lessons that extended beyond Africa to developing countries around the world facing similar challenges with resource extraction and corruption. Delegations from Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific visited to study the model and adapt its principles to their own contexts. International development organizations began incorporating transparency and accountability measures into their programs. Recognizing that sustainable development required more than just financial investment, it required systems that ensured benefits reached intended beneficiaries. The success challenged conventional wisdom about development, demonstrating that small countries could successfully confront powerful international interests when they had strong leadership, engaged citizenry, and effective institutions. Academic research into the Burkina Faso model influenced policy discussions in international forums, contributing to new approaches to development cooperation and resource governance. The case became required study in courses on development economics, political science, and international relations. Years after that historic dawn parade through the streets of Ouagadougou, the transformation of Burkina Faso continued to inspire hope and action across Africa and beyond. The simple act of exposing theft in broad daylight had demonstrated that transparency and courage could overcome decades of exploitation and corruption. President Ibrahim Traoré, looking back on the events that had defined his presidency, often reflected on the courage of young Boukari, whose determination to report suspected theft had catalyzed a national transformation. That teenager's willingness to walk for days to deliver a message had ultimately changed not just his own country, but had inspired a continental awakening. The gold that had been recovered that morning had been transformed into schools, hospitals, roads, and opportunities for millions of citizens. But perhaps more importantly, the confidence and self-determination that had been recovered along with. The gold continued to drive progress and development. The fight against resource theft and corruption required constant vigilance, adaptation, and courage. New challenges would emerge, criminal networks would evolve their methods, and each generation would need to defend the principles of transparency and accountability. But the foundation had been established. The precedent had been set. The psychological barrier that had prevented African countries from challenging foreign exploitation had been shattered. Future generations would grow up knowing that their natural wealth belonged to them, not to foreign interests operating in shadows. As the sun set over Ouagadougou on each anniversary of that historic parade, citizens could see the fruits of their victory in the streetlights that now illuminated previously dark neighborhoods, the schools where their children learned about their rights and responsibilities, and the hospitals where their families received health care funded by their own natural wealth. The message that had echoed through the streets that morning, "Behold the thieves of Africa," had evolved into something even more powerful. Behold, the wealth of Africa, protected by Africans, for Africans. The dawn that had broken on that extraordinary day had not ended. It continued to spread, illuminating corners of the continent where exploitation had previously thrived in darkness, inspiring new generations of leaders and citizens who refused to accept theft as inevitable. The Golden Parade had ended, but the golden age of African self-determination it had inaugurated was just beginning. And in the heart of West Africa, in the country that had dared to expose the thieves and reclaim its wealth, the people continued their march toward a future where their children's inheritance would never again be stolen in the darkness of night. The story that began with stolen gold had become something far more valuable. A story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable spirit of a people determined to control their own destiny. And that story, like the gold that had sparked it, belonged to Africa and would remain in Africa forever.